Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending time with us. My guest today is Ben Katchor, MacArthur Grant-winning cartoonist and author of the new book, The Dairy Restaurant. In his book, Ben tells the history and cultural significance of dairy restaurants, which were largely Jewish-owned establishments that served only dairy dishes and no meat. Though dairy restaurants have mostly closed their doors, Ben takes a deep dive into their history and explores what they meant to him growing up in New York City. Ben is best known for his critically acclaimed comic strip, Julius Knipple, Real Estate Photographer, that he wrote and illustrated for the Forward newspaper. He was also the first cartoonist to receive a MacArthur Fellowship and currently teaches at Parsons School of Design, the new school in New York City. In our conversation today, I'll be speaking with Ben about his book and what inspired him to write about the history of the dairy restaurant, a place that used to be such an integral part of the Jewish community in New York City and other places, especially in New York's Lower East Side. We'll also talk about the extent of Ben's research, why dairy restaurants were so important at their peak, and how dairy restaurants have impacted modern Jewish food experiences. Ben, welcome to the program. Good to have you with us.
Great to be at home. I'm not there. I'm not anywhere. I'm home.
Well, we're at home as well, and we're using our time, I hope, productively, and certainly will be in the next half hour or so. Before we talk about the dairy restaurant and about the book, I'd like to talk a little about you. In an interview you did with Magenta, the design website, you talked about your youth, about drawing comic strips very early, how you took a course in art at the Brooklyn Museum, which greatly influenced your career, and also about your father, who was an immigrant from Poland, who encouraged you in your work. Tell us about that.
I think he grew up in interwar Warsaw. He left as a young man. But he always wanted to study the violin as a young man, and his family just couldn't afford that. He was apprenticed very young to be a tailor. And I think when, I appeared on the scene, he was really happy to be able to afford to subsidize and help me do what I wanted to do in the arts. So, that's, I think, what you're referring to.
Well, he recognized something because he didn't, as you point out, he didn't push you into to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be something that you didn't want to be.
Yeah, no, it's one of the themes that comes up through all this research is that this his generation and a lot of this first generation of small restaurant owners in New York did not want their children to go into their business only because it was very difficult work. I mean, these were hands-on restaurateurs, the wife in the kitchen, the husband in the front of the room, or vice versa. I mean, that's one reason they didn't go on past that first generation. Most of the children of most of these people went into various professions. And, my father had I don't know where he thought art was, whether he thought that was a business at all. Probably not. I think he understood that was something usually subsidized by other activities. As a child, he didn't. He saw that as a kind of worthwhile thing to help me do. I mean, he was a tailor, and then had a chicken farm and hotel, and then later in his life, he ended up as a small real estate business in Brooklyn. So I don't think. And those were not areas I was interested in. And so, I think he understood the value of studying drawing, or I don't know what he made of comics. It seemed to him like an American thing that he was not terribly familiar with as a form.
Well, let's talk about New York City. You grew up in Brooklyn. New York is the venue for much of your work, and there clearly is a very strong attachment for New York City in your work. The New York City, perhaps of some decades before you were born, and maybe even into the period where you became a young man in New York. But not only in the dairy restaurant that you feature in this book, but also in the architecture. It seems you have a great interest in that. In all of your work, the architecture of neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, with these 4- and 5-story buildings where there were shops on the main floor. Tell us about why New York is so important to you.
Well, it's where I grew up, and I've lived most of my life. So I can't, and I didn't leave. I didn't come there. A lot of people arrive in New York from other parts of the world. I was born there and started to understand what it meant to live in a city of that age. I mean, something you mentioned in the introduction, this a whole idea of Jewish community. Another thing my research showed me is how different Jews are. I mean, they all have their own ideas of what it even means to be a Jew, much less being part of any organizational Jewish life. And that's, something I had not much to do with growing up. I mean, I was kind of, English was my main language. I didn't even begin to read much in Yiddish until much later. These restaurants, especially these early ones in New York, were very much a political matter. You could go to a cafe or a small restaurant that catered to your particular political ideology, Tolstoyan vegetarians, socialist cafes, anarchist cafes. And I think as a last resort, when people had to eat, they had to kind of put some of those ideas aside and eat wherever they could afford to eat or whatever was open. So a lot of these more successful and larger dairy restaurants, everybody ended up eating there. That's also something the cultural history reveals.
Well, we've gotten into the restaurants, but before we talk about the dairy restaurant, I have to say that your book is about dairy restaurants, but before you get to the dairy restaurants, you have a brief history of eating. You have a biblical eating habits. You talk about Abraham's tent, for example, Jewish dietary laws and preferences. Then there's a history of restaurants. You also have a history of dairy. There's even instructions on how to milk a cow.
Yeah.
In order to set the stage for the discussion about the restaurants, and it's probably good to, because I mentioned it in the introduction as well. A dairy restaurant was not strictly dairy because you have many menus, and on these menus I see that they serve fish. So they weren't really vegetarian restaurants. No. They were really everything other than meat.
Right.
Would that be a correct?
Yeah, fish can be eaten in Jewish dietary law. Fish can be eaten with dairy products, right? But the reason I go back to the history is because Jews lived in this world, and this is all very tied in to the larger world they lived in. And I just wanted to explain how they participated in that larger world. I mean, the idea of a dairy or a restaurant couldn't exist without the French invention of the restaurant. That's not something that existed through all time. There were eating places, taverns, other kinds of eating establishments, semi-open to the public, but they were not the restaurant. The idea of a menu where everyone in the place was eating the food of their choice. The earlier setup would be that, the plate of the day, everybody would be eating the same thing. So, I mean, just on that level, the dairy restaurant is part of this larger world history. And the other thing is, I explain that I described this kind of personality, the milchdika personality, the dairy personality, as this kind of person who has one foot out of this world. and they get involved in very deep rumination, maybe out of control rumination. That was kind of my approach to the book in that way. It's a very personal approach to writing about something, that everything is interconnected. And, where do you stop? Where do you stop drawing those interconnections? And so
Well,
it leads to all those things you mentioned.
You have an exhaustive listing, and listing does not really, the word does not do what you've done here credit, because you not only have listing of the restaurants, but there are vignettes about dozens of restaurants, the owners, when they got started, when they began, how long. Some of these restaurants didn't last very long, based on what you said, and some of them lasted many years. And not only in the Lower East Side, but in Manhattan. You also mentioned later on in the book about Baltimore and Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles. But New York really was the locus for so much of this. You have menus, and you have little vignettes also that came from newspaper clippings. Tell us about this immense research work that you did, because if you go to the Lower East Side today, for example, we know, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit later about the Garden Cafeteria, so we'll leave that for a moment, because I have a small connection to that, personal connection. But these are just addresses today. So you would have had to have done this immense research operation. Tell us about that.
Well, I back in the 80s, I had this, my interest in Jewish food began, and I started to get in touch with some of the people who are interviewed in this book. They were still around. The research, it's not a subject a lot was written about, because before the late 20th century, these ideas of interviewing or documenting working class occupations, like these small restaurants, that just wasn't a popular thing. Sort of the upper classes were more written about. So a lot of this got lost, and a lot of it only survives in kind of oblique mentions and spread throughout all of recorded history. So ads in Yiddish newspapers, little congratulatory ads in Jewish organizational annuals, things like that, matchbook labels that were paper matchbooks that would come up on eBay. The digitization of all of this information helped. A lot of this is now accessible. It would have been really difficult to do a book like this before the internet and all of the genealogical research you can do today.
Well, it's amazing, just the number of menus. For example, I happen to be probably one of the few folks left, at least of our generation, that happens to like Schav. Mm-hmm. So I see at Steinberg's, I'm looking at their menu. You could buy a bowl of cold Schav with sour cream for 25 cents. I don't know what year that was, but clearly that was a long time ago. Kasha. Then we've got Rappaport's here. I'm looking at stuffed peppers and kasha varnishkis, etc. These were not small menus. These were not limited menus. There's an amazing amount of dishes, and that must have meant that if a restaurant was successful, that there were a lot of folks coming in to eat. I mean, this was quite an offering to come in off the street and have this kind of bounty, if you will, on the menu. So the menus, I guess, tell you a little about not only eating habits, but also about the business of dairy restaurants.
Yeah, the menus, in a large part, overlap with American luncheonette menus and American restaurant menus. I'd say only about sometimes 20 or 30% were dishes that could be traced to Eastern Europe. Otherwise, lots of other dishes, salads, tuna fish sandwiches, things we think of as American lunch dishes show up on these menus. But that limitation of not being able to have a hamburger, if that's what you felt like eating, set these restaurants aside and kind of limited their clientele. Because you could also have the vegetarian dairy dishes in an American luncheonette too. Some of these dishes made that move over. And then there's the whole thing you mentioned of the kind of American kosher style restaurant that incorporated blintzes and pot roast and roast ham, and completely these were just dishes from world cuisine that they would serve. So the dairy restaurant, it really depended on having a sizable clientele that was familiar with these dishes, these Eastern European dairy dishes, and wanted to eat them. And once that population moved, or if it wasn't large enough, like in a lot of other cities in America, other than New York, there would only be one, if that, one or two dairy restaurants.
Well, you cover some of the names that I recognize. I mean, I do remember Ratner's, of course. I remember the onion rolls at Ratner's, but you mentioned the Steinbergs and the famous. I want to talk about the famous Isaac Bashevis Singer. You mentioned there are a number of other luminaries who used to eat at these places, or would stop by, or would campaign. Some politicians would come down. It was good campaigning if you came into some of these restaurants. But let's talk a little about the famous and Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great author, and he was a regular at the famous.
Yeah, he became a kind of militant vegetarian later in his life. I think he was 65 when that happened, and that there is a big overlap between vegetarianism and dairy restaurants. There was even a Yiddish vegetarian movement. So he was part of that overlap. I mean, when the famous closed, he just went to a Greek coffee shop and ordered a vegetarian lunch. So he didn't specifically have to go to a Jewish dairy restaurant, and he didn't. Yeah, he lived in the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood where he lived,
But clearly it was not just comfort food, but he was comfortable with the setting, it seemed.
He also was a regular at the Dairy Garden on East Broadway, which was up the block from the Forwards building. And it was where a lot of people, journalists and people who wrote for that paper would have their
I want to talk about the Garden Cafeteria. It was on the corner, I do remember, of that block. And that block was what was left of, if we could call it, the Jewish or Yiddish Fleet Street.
Yeah.
Because I think the Garden was at 165, and then the Forward Building. And then to the left of the Forward Building were the offices of Der Tag Morgen Journal, which was the last competitor to the Forwards. And you talk about the Garden and the card that you would get in, which was punched with the cost of the particular dish that you were ordering. Was the Garden at its height? And in your drawings, I mean, I imagine you really had to conjure up what these folks looked like as you were making these drawings to illustrate the book. But tell us what it might have been like if you walked into the Garden in at the height of its popularity. Who would be there in addition to Bashevis Singer? Who else might be there?
Neighborhood people, and as the demographic of the neighborhood changed, that would change too. I went there a lot in the 70s. I went to meetings at the Educational Alliance every Friday night. There was an organization called the Alliance of Figurative Painters. And so there was just a convenient place to have dinner before those meetings. So there were a lot of painters there who were, before they walked over to the Educational Alliance. But it was a busy cafeteria, Black, Puerto Rican people, anyone who lived in the neighborhood went there. I think it had kind of moved beyond being a specifically Jewish restaurant. It was just a really popular neighborhood cafeteria.
When I was in college, I was raised in New Hampshire, but I would go to New York on vacations, and my father was a subscriber to Der Tag Morgen Journal. So occasionally I would go down to the Lower East Side. This is now in the early 70s. To go down and just take a look and kind of imagine what it might have been like. And there wasn't much left on the block. You're right. It was the Educational Alliance. It was the Der Tag Morgen Journal. It was the Forwards and the Garden Cafeteria. And that was a kind of an intact block of what it might have looked like decades before. And I would stop in at the garden just to kind of breathe in some of that atmosphere. But there really wasn't much left on the scene in terms of these kinds of restaurants. Let's talk about their demise. What happened?
Well, it's a combination of, well, as I mentioned, these people didn't encourage their children to go into the restaurant business. And the ones who did would not have gone into a Jewish dairy. They would have gone into a more kind of upscale American restaurant business. That's one factor. Another big factor is the demise of a lot of Jews during the war, the Holocaust. A lot of the people who invented that cuisine were gone. And assimilation, people, seeing that as a very narrow part of world cuisine. There's so many other things you could eat. That's another factor. And I mean, apparently a lot of Ashkenazi Jews have a lactose intolerance. So although the food in these places was mainly cheese, sour cream, dairy dishes with lower lactose content. So that's a small factor because that always people put up with whatever indigestion they suffered from eating all kinds of Jewish food.
So, well, there were dozens and dozens of these places, so they were all eating, whether they were lactose intolerant or not. They found it to be good. But let me ask you about the restaurants influencing modern cuisine, Jewish and non-Jewish. Is there? I mean, today we have vegetarian restaurants.
Yeah.
Was it more about the atmosphere, or was it about the food? In other words, you can go into a vegetarian restaurant today, but it's not quite the same as having gone into the garden or the famous in the 1940s.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Is there a connection today?
Yeah. Well, one thing you mentioned in the introduction, it's not quite accurate. There are lots of Jewish dairy restaurants today, but they'd be labeled as kosher pizzerias or other kinds of, there's a whole realm of upscale dairy restaurants that exist in Jewish neighborhoods today. So that still exists. The kind of dairy restaurant I encountered back in the 70s and 80s, the tail end of this Eastern European cuisine, as opposed to a more Mediterranean-facing or and later Israeli-facing cuisine. That's what's disappeared. And what's disappeared also is the whole idea of a Jewish working class restaurant. Again, that still exists. If you go to a Hasidic neighborhood, there is still these kind of working class small restaurants. But that's what I kind of miss, the aesthetic of the working class Jew in New York. And that's tied to economics and other issues. But that's really what's vanished. Not anybody can open up a restaurant today and make these, even exactly replicate this menu. But chances are it's not going to be part of that first generation Jewish working class. And why Jews left the working class, it seems, to one history that seems inevitable and a positive thing. But from an aesthetic point of view, it's not at all. I mean, we have Starbucks is owned by someone of Jewish descent. It's the most boring kind of the death of any kind of cafe culture. It's a terrible invention, in my opinion. So
I sense a certain wistfulness here, and I think I can understand it. I know that my father, when we would visit Brooklyn, would take me to Dubrow's, which was not precisely a dairy restaurant. It was a Jewish cafeteria, and it was at East 16th Street and Kings Highway, and that was a big deal to be able to go with him to that. So I caught a little bit of that, but I sense in your writing and in your drawing a wistfulness for this time. Was that a good characterization?
Yeah, well, wistful. I mean, the aesthetics of these places that didn't have unlimited resources to spend on decor. I mean, the concentration was on the quality of the food, and there was a complete surrounding working class culture. That's what I don't say I want to replicate it, because I don't know that that's possible. But the aesthetics of it, I think that can be thought about. Like, can we have individual, uniquely run restaurants, or does the world have to be overrun by chain restaurants? And I don't think that's just a strong feeling I have.
Well, I think I read, I think at the end of perhaps the review of your book in the New York Times, it said that you were at B&H, which is a dairy restaurant on 2nd Avenue, and you met your wife as a result of sitting next to her. I think she asked you what you were eating, or you asked her. I think it was gefilte fish on somebody's plate. Yeah, and it. I have not a similar story, but a connection. I was married actually in Tel Aviv many years ago, and on the day of our wedding, my wife and my wife to be and her family were getting ready for the preparations for the wedding, and I had the morning free, the day free, and so I went to a little restaurant at the lower end of Allenby Street called Strauss, not connected to Strauss of the big dairy in Israel, but this was a family Strauss. And I remember having stuffed peppers that day, vegetarian stuffed peppers. So that also stayed with me when I think about that particular time. And the story about you were sitting in B&H and meeting your wife that way, I think was a fitting way to sum up your attachment to the dairy restaurant. So,
I mean, that's one of these strange coincidences. But I mean, I like them for other reasons too.
I know, I'm sure you do. Ben, you make a reference in the book to dairy restaurants outside New York, and one of the notes that you make is that there was a meeting of B'nai B'rith in Denver in 1908 held at the Home Dairy Restaurant. It was an event to celebrate what they called B'nai B'rith Day, which was something that B'nai B'rith did in various cities around the country. Tell us about why they may have gone to that restaurant, that particular restaurant.
Well, part of this history of dairy restaurants led me to discover that there was a very widespread phenomenon in America in the late 1800s called the dairy lunch. And there were hundreds of these restaurants all over the country. And they served, the big claim to attract people was that they had fresh milk, and they would have a small dairy menu, things like, toast and milk toast, pancakes, non-meat things, but they also would have a full meat menu. And the Home Dairy, it was a dairy company. They had all of these restaurants around the country, and it was common for Jews, especially in cities where there wasn't a specifically Jewish restaurant, to hold events at places that would accommodate them, whether with a special menu for that night or not, depending on how strictly they wanted to observe these dietary laws. But that's the question of whether these American dairy restaurants and dairy lunchrooms, what the influence on Jewish dairy restaurants is something I go into in the book. So that's that case. That's a case of that.
Ben, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about your book. The book is The Dairy Restaurant, published by Schocken Next Book. It's available online wherever you purchase books. Well, if you like what you've heard so far, make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to visit our website, benabruth.org, to learn about our work. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For my guest, Ben Katchor, I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time. Stay safe, everyone.